One of the aims of this forum has been to present the dimensions and scale of global change and its implications from the future. Clearly, it extends beyond climate change, but the overall impact of global change is truly dire. It's also very clear that we have far less time to act than we might have thought. So far, we have confined our discussion to the science, but we often overlook the social impacts. COVID has provided us with a glimpse of what is in store. A leaked report from the Department of Defence recently stated that we are poorly equipped to cope with many of the threats that are appearing now. Increased risk of war, potential for collapse of many institutions that underpin our society, and the potential collapse of civil society as we know it today. We can see evidence of this in other parts of the world where global environmental change has already had a major impact. Famine, economic collapse, civil war, persecution of minority groups and mass migration are some examples, but there are many more. Australia might be isolated from this for a while, but we will not be immune. We should ask how we will cope when our most important food bowl, the Murray-Darling Basin, collapses. It's already under stress and its days may well be numbered. Where will the jobs come from in the future? What are the implications for the unemployed today? Particularly the young at a time of increasing social, economic stress and human suffering. The social implications are endless. So it's time to introduce Robyn. Robyn Eckersley is a Professor of Political Science at the University of Melbourne. She has published widely in the fields of environmental politics, political theory and international relations, with a special focus on the ethics, politics and governance of climate change. She is a Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia since 2007, and she received a Distinguished Scholar Award by the Environmental Studies section of the International Studies Association in 2019. So please welcome Robyn.
Well, first, thank you very much, Roger, for inviting me to this session, and thanks to everyone for coming along. It's nice to have a live audience after teaching Zoom for most of this year. So, David and Will had the easy part. I was given the topic, where to from here, the politics of change. So this is, as Max Weber described politics, the slow boring of hard boards. The forum is about planning for the future. In this not yet fully or officially declared epoch of the Anthropocene, where humans have become the dominant force shaping Earth systems. So we've heard the scientific view of the challenge, but we all know whether we meet this challenge or not actually depends on the politics. So this is what I'm going to turn to. And the problem in Australia that we have to confront is that our government is looking backwards, not forwards. And insofar as they have a plan for the future, it's to continue what we've always done in the past. In this case, continue with a fossil fuel-based approach. And we've seen this with our gas-led COVID recovery and desperate attempts to keep the Liddell coal-fired power station in New South Wales going, despite, contrary to the advice of the committee that was supposed to look into it. According to a new report published by the Climate Council, of which Will is a member, growing emissions associated with gas production are now actually undermining the promising growth in renewable energy in Australia. So Australia's been ranked number 56 out of the 61 countries surveyed in the 2020 Climate Performance Index. And the only cold comfort we have is that we were ahead of the US, which was ranked last. And this is hardly surprising given that we have a very weak target for 2030, minus 26 to 28%, because developed countries are supposed to lead in mitigation, and this is not leadership. We don't have a credible climate or energy policy. The Emissions Reduction Fund is a nonsensical policy because you can't ramp it up. It just becomes too expensive. We have no post-2020 renewable energy target. And when Scott Morrison was Treasurer in 2018, he cancelled any further contributions from Australia to the Green Climate Fund, which is there to assist developing countries leapfrog over the fossil fuel path that we enjoyed. You might have thought that the unprecedented fires of last summer might have been a wake-up call. The Royal Commission into National Disaster national natural disaster arrangements, which was set up to the credit of the Morrison government to inquire into how Australia can be more prepared for events like this, the Commission declared that Australia's climate-related natural disaster outlook is alarming. A YouGov survey conducted in January during the height of the fires commissioned by the Australia Institute found that of those that were impacted by the fires, they all agreed with the proposition that this is a wake-up call to the world on the impact of climate change. And 70% of those not impacted by the fires agreed. Yet for the most part, our government has refused to join the dots. And as fate would have it, we got our first COVID infections in February when the fires were still burning. And that's pretty much redirected attention to the COVID pandemic. So if the fires aren't one of those this changes everything moments, what will it take to shift national government policy here? And what sort of political changes are needed to navigate the Anthropocene? And is in fact the Anthropocene something we can reasonably plan for? So what I want to do in this presentation is address these questions by starting with the main structural obstacles to political change in this country. And I'm focusing on the national level because the subnational level has actually been doing some good things, and I'll finish with that briefly. And I want to turn to the more daunting challenge of not just the energy transition, but a broader transition to an ecological sustainable society. So with the structural changes, I'm first going to look at the Australian democratic system and then our carboniferous economy before I turn to those last questions. So let's start with a puzzle. The Lowy Institute has been polling Australian views on climate change since 2006, and the most recent 2020 poll, which was looking at 2019 data, found that 61% of those surveyed agreed that global warming is a serious and pressing problem and that we should begin taking steps now, even if this involves significant costs. So why is the government ignoring majority opinion? Is there something wrong with our democracy? Is the first question we have to ask. Now, all democracies are ultimately just an artefact of the political institutions and constitutions that create them. The voting systems, whether you've got a unicameral or a bicameral parliament, whether it's a federation, and the configuration of political party competition. Now, the Australian system has some significant obstacles. The voting system for the lower house favours the major parties, neither of which have refurbished their fundamental platforms to deal with the changes that are coming down the tube towards us. So it's hard for new parties to gain control of the lower house where government's formed. And because we have a bicameral system with a different voting system in the upper house, the Senate, we've seen a lot of initiatives be blocked, like the carbon pollution reduction scheme, or go in reverse. But of course, this can work both ways in politics, and that needs to be noted. But of course, we all know there's intense ideological divisions between the major parties on climate change, and that has pretty much stymied any significant progress at the national level. The thing is that the Liberal Party could not govern in its own right. It can only govern with a National Party, and they do a deal about where they're going to stand their members in which, or rather candidates in seats. The ALP is now struggling to govern in its own right because of profound structural changes with the shift from Fordist modes of accumulation to post-Fordist modes and a weakening union movement. So they're doing a split between a more conservative working class and the new middle class, which is increasingly wanting to vote Green. And yet the Labor Party and the Greens are like the Liberation Front of Judea and the Judean Liberation Front. They fight with each other and forget about the Romans. So the net result is that we don't have a winning coalition in the federal parliament, and that's blocking change, despite the fact that a majority of Australians want change. And we know that elections are fought and won in marginal seats, which is why a lot of campaigns fly in the face of majority opinion. And of course, we can't finish this narrative without mentioning the Murdoch press, and that's just code for sowing seeds of doubt about climate change, as we all know. So that's a pretty depressing roundup. However, there's two little silver linings there. What's different about political polarisation in our political system at the national level compared to other Anglosphere countries is that we have polarisation not only between but within the major parties. So this raises the prospect of picking out all the members of the major parties that care about climate change and other parties in the parliament. You could possibly summon a majority there, and this is the thinking behind Zali Steggall's new bill, which is modelled on the UK Climate Act, which is trying to get a conscious vote, like we did on the same-sex marriage. Now, it's not likely in the current term, but I think it's going to come back. I know Adam Bandt is supporting it, and there are some Liberals that are supporting it too. So watch this space. The second interesting feature of our system is a federal system provides a lot more political opportunity structures for climate champions and advocates. And we've seen significant legislation at the subnational level. I've recently done a study on that, and we found out that while the UK Climate Act in 2008 is widely seen as the gold standard, because it has a legislated 2050 emissions target and a series of progressive carbon budgets to reach it, little old South Australia got there first. In 2007, that was the first bit of climate legislation in the world that legislated a target and a couple of interim targets to get there. And now we've also got it in South Australia, Victoria and the ACT. And the ACT legislation is gold standard. Sure, it's small. They don't have a coal problem there. But still, it's model legislation. And that's come from the subnational level, picking up the slack and compensating for failure at the national level. So let's now turn to our carboniferous economy. Australia's export economy has always depended on primary industry, particularly agriculture, but now increasingly mining. We know that coal and gas are amongst our biggest export earners, even though most of employment comes in the service sector in this country. And as a result of that, the major parties have shared a concern with international competitiveness. And that's led to this fixation with the upfront costs of action and ignoring the long-term costs of inaction and the co-benefits of early action. And so this has been the problem. This has been the sort of groupthink amongst the non-climate factions in the major parties. We also know that regional communities and regional identities have been built up around coal. And so this is something we need to pay attention to. So these and other factors have led to what those who study socio-technical transitions call carbon lock-in, a kind of inertia that inhibits the development of new systems. The problem is that on current rates of emissions growth, we only have a few years left, and we've heard this from David, to blow our 1.5 degree budget. And the latest production gap report, which measures the gap between actual and estimated fossil fuel production and what's needed to reach the Paris temperature targets, has found that we're actually more than doubling at the fossil fuel production that would be consistent with a 1.5 degree pathway. So Australia is clearly one of the guilty parties here. And their position can mean only one of three things, and we really need to call them out on this. First, that the rest of the world, including poor countries, must carry some of our burden. Two, the next generations of Australians will have to endure drastic and probably impossible rates of emission reductions to keep to those Paris targets. Or three, that the government doesn't believe in the targets, has abandoned them, and accepts and is unmoved by the enormous suffering that will occur in a world that is much hotter than 2 degrees. We have to call them out and say, which one of these three is it? One further bit of research on the question of carbon lock-in says that it's generally maintained by a range of things, but including the capture and co-optation of the state by incumbent interests. And I think Australia is also a textbook case here, because there's very close ties and a revolving door between the mining industry, lobbyists, and national resources and energy ministers, and of course their advisors as well. And this has seen Australia actually slide down the corruption index that's maintained by Transparency International. And again, we need to call out the government on this. We need stricter regulation on political lobbying and political donations, and more public rather than private funding for parties based on their electoral performance in the last election. That would go some way to help. The final thing that the socio-technical transliterature teaches us is that nurturing and building support for renewable energy is fantastic and necessary, but not enough. The fossil fuel industry won't go away. It'll dig in and fight, and unless you actively develop policies to phase it out, it will not go. And that's really important. And there's an obvious solution to this, and this is just transition. We have a responsibility to look after the communities that will be dislocated by this transition. And the International Labour Organisation has already developed some very clear and fair guidelines for just transition. We've known for years when our coal plants were due to retire. In fact, in 2017, the Senate produced a report on retirement of coal-fired power stations in Australia, and it recommended just transition. And they recommended a transition plan. So we need a national transition plan, and moreover, we need a national transition institution to manage that. Spain has a ministry for ecological transition and a minister for ecological transition. We need that too. So now let's look to the bigger challenge. It's not enough to move away from fossil fuels and develop a 100% renewable energy system. We need to reduce emissions in all sectors. But even if by some miracle we were able to do that and find a new Dyson vacuum cleaner that sucked emissions out of the atmosphere, there still is another ecological crisis, and Will has spoken of that. There are 9 planetary boundaries. Biodiversity is even more critical at the moment than climate change. The build-up of plastics in the ocean, the build-up of toxic wastes, depletion of natural resources, deforestation, the list is long. So what we need is something equivalent to what Karl Polanyi described as the Great Transformation when he examined the shift towards a market economy in the 19th century. So what we need is a great green transformation. That's what's needed, not just of the economy, but of society. It's a societal transformation, not just a transition from one system of provisioning to the next in energy services, although that's certainly essential. We need something much bigger than this if we're going to meet the sorts of challenges that Will has presented to us today. But then we have to confront another structural obstacle that has been identified by critical ecological theorists of the state. And the problem here is really tricky, and that is that states and capitalist systems are mutually dependent. Firms have no incentive to internalise or avoid ecological costs in the absence of regulation, and states have no incentive to provide the kind of regulation that's necessary to prevent the externalisation of ecological costs, because this is to protect local ecosystems as well as planetary boundaries, because they are dependent on the revenue from growth. They need that to provide the taxation and also to provide the employment. So there's a mutual interdependency, and some scholars in this field say there's a kind of a glass ceiling that we don't seem to be able to break. It explains why some of the more progressive governments are thinking about green growth, but no one is talking about degrowth. It's political suicide. And there's a tragedy here too, because you need a bigger state with more funds to manage the transition. So we really have a dilemma here, and going forward and addressing the challenge of political change requires some very tricky navigation. Because one thing is clear, states, and we think of subnational governments and also city governments and municipal governments here, all of which play an essential role if there's going to be a transition. They're the only institution, particularly at the national level, that has the regulatory powers, the resources and financial transfer mechanisms to manage a transition, to facilitate the restructuring or the new regional economic development for those areas that have to go through an energy transition, and also the finance and support when those climate impacts start to hit us. The costs of climate change, the damage costs, are not factored into federal budgets. And they're going to grow and grow over time and compete with welfare budgets, defence budgets, and so forth. So we have to think hard and quick if we're going to start dealing with this. We need more public revenue, we need more taxation, it needs to be more progressive. And we need greater wealth and income redistribution if we're going to no longer rely on material energy growth to actually address inequality and unemployment. So we need a welfare state, a green welfare state, to manage the transition, is my bottom line here. Now, there's a big debate in my field about those who advocate green growth and those that advocate degrowth, and it's been going on for a while. But most of the proposals for Green New Deals that have cropped up in the age of COVID are understandably promoting green growth, because it is, after all, a recession. And the ultimate ideal of a post-growth society does require a huge amount of investment in green infrastructure. So for me, I think a more productive debate is not between green growth and post-growth, but rather good quality growth and bad quality growth. And that's determined in terms of what our ultimate ends are. The ends of the world, or the purpose in life, is not to solve climate change. The purpose in life is to deal with climate change so we can focus on what the important purpose of life is, which is to live a good quality life. And I'm thinking here about life with a capital L, life, all life on Earth. So they're the sort of big things that we need to look after, and that should determine what good quality growth is and bad quality growth. Because as Herman Daly said, you can have qualitative growth without increasing energy use, material throughput, waste and emissions. It is possible. We can't design this from the beginning. I've always used the metaphor we have to rebuild the ship while still at sea. I don't think blueprints or green prints, big master plans are necessarily the way to go. We have to think of a more agile way of approaching the transition challenge. And in a recent article I suggested critical problem solving, which is requires a kind of conjunctional analysis of different political contexts. And from that analysis, you identify what are the next best, most transformatory steps. By next best, I mean the politically possible, because if they're impossible, it's not going to happen, which can then be examined, scaled up or scaled down, depending on the feedback loops, which we can never fully anticipate. So it's a kind of stepwise approach, but it does need creative visualization of the future we want, but it needs to be reflexive, dynamic and inclusive, because we need a lot of imagination from the community, not just planners, not just scientists and so forth, to make this work, to work in a way that makes it politically legitimate and acceptable. There are some critical social scientists that say the Anthropocene is not a governable object. It's too abstract, it's too difficult, it doesn't relate to the way everyday people live, and that it could be anti-democratic. I think some of those are they don't think through the challenge enough, because if we don't deal with it, we're unlikely to have democracy anyway, but that's another debate. Certainly the rise of nationalist populism is a challenge because it rejects science, it hates cosmopolitan elites, it's nationalist and it's anti-globalist. But funnily enough, the climate movement and nationalist populists have a common foe, and that's neoliberal globalisation, so it's kind of ironic. But of course they're poles apart. I think that arguing that the state plays a critical and essential role needs to be recognised, and we need mobilisation for new policies, new ideas. But to finish on a bright note, and Will was beckoning me to say something at least a little bit optimistic, so I'm scraping the barrel and coming up with something here for you. And that is, we've actually seen quite a bit of movement at the subnational level. It's really quite exciting, particularly in Victoria, with our Climate Change Act. We're about to have our new targets. The announcement of our new interim targets has been postponed because of COVID. Dan's been doing a lot of press conferences on other matters for most of this year, but hopefully we'll hear them before Christmas. But Victoria's concern and action here is thanks to political mobilisation, the growth of progressive business, market forces, new financial new developments in the financial sector, mobilisation by civil society, and many other places. So the tide is slowly turning. I just worry that it's just not going to turn fast enough. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Robyn, for that presentation. We will now take a 10-minute break. We'll be back at 5 minutes to 3. If anyone wants to have a drink or a coffee, there is the bar outside. You might feel you want a stiff whiskey now, I think. So we'll conclude this session and we'll be back here just before 5:02. Thank you. Members, the Honourable Adam Bandt, Member of Parliament, who is Leader of the Greens in the Federal Parliament and holds the seat of Melbourne. And Sally Capp, who has just been elected as Lord Mayor for the City of Melbourne for her second term. Sally and Adam have reviewed the speaker presentations, and there's a lot of material, a lot of reading and homework, and other background information, and will provide a response, their vision for a way forward. Now let us assume for today that Adam has become Prime Minister and can provide some desperately needed leadership. Adam, you now have the floor. There we are.
From here?
Yep.
Not from the lectern? Okay. Thanks very much, and I want to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri, the traditional owners, and pay respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge that as we tackle the climate crisis and environment crisis that we're facing and the various other interlinked crises, that we must put First Nations people and First Nations learning and First Nations justice at the heart of everything that we do. And I also want to thank you for the invitation to be here and acknowledge my other panellists and also congratulate Sally Capp on her re-election as Lord Mayor of Melbourne. If I were Prime Minister, made Prime Minister, which is the starting point of this, what would we do? So the first thing to do is declare an environment and climate emergency. I mean, that's something that wouldn't require legislation, and it's a very important act and a very important thing to do from the highest level of government downwards, because the first step in fixing a problem is acknowledging that you've got a problem. And at the moment, you've heard from the other panellists about the severity and the urgency of the climate and environment challenge that we are facing, and it is an emergency. But one of the things that I think influences the way that people talk about the climate challenge in Australia, is that it's something that we've got decades to deal with. And so talk of targets around 2050, 2060, 2070 and so on can tend to suggest that, and including for all levels of public policy, but also importantly public opinion, can suggest that we've got a very long time to fix things, whereas in fact we don't. And so leadership from the highest levels to declare how quickly we need to move is absolutely critical. But it's also, I think, going to be important to understand and accept the central premise of what's been put to us from the papers so far, that we're facing a number of crises at the moment and that they're interlinked, but that critically the solutions to one are the solutions to all. And so we've got to acknowledge that we're facing an inequality crisis as well, and also that we are in the middle of an economic crisis, especially in places here in Melbourne, but we're in the middle of an economic crisis trying to find our way out. And the pathway to dealing with one has to be the pathway to dealing with all of them. But if you go to the doctor and the doctor tells you that you've got 3 things wrong with you and I can give you a medicine that fixes one or a medicine that fixes all 3, you take the medicine that fixes all 3. And that is the situation that we are in at the moment. And that is why what is needed is a government-led plan of investment and action that tackles the inequality and jobs crises that we're facing by growing the industries that will also tackle the climate emergency. And that, I think, is something that will have the best chance of success amongst the population, not only of being accepted, but of being successful as well. Key to that, on the environment and climate side of it, we've got to get our electricity system running on 100% renewables as quickly as we possibly can. Not only because it is, in a sense, the easiest thing to do because the technology is there and it's substitutable right now. We could begin that process and complete it immediately, and we in the Greens would say we need a 10-year plan to get Australia being zero emissions electricity by 2030. But getting your electricity industry to zero is key to unlocking pollution cuts in other sectors of the economy as well. It allows you to get electric cars and vehicles. It allows you to then get industry switching off gas and running on electricity. So doing that first is not only right because it's the easiest, but it's also important because it then unlocks the further changes that can flow across the rest of the economy. So once we've done that, side by side with that, but that will then make it easier to transform our transport system by massively expanding public transport and cycling usage and electrifying all the cars, buses and trucks on our roads, and also transforming, as I said, our industrial system, moving towards mass electrification and green hydrogen feedstock and moving to a zero-waste circular economy. Also, critically, we're going to need to transform our land management system by caring for country, and not only by changing our national environment laws, which is something that I'd put to Parliament as a matter of urgency, but also to better protect our existing native species and carbon stocks. And this is key, and this comes back to the point about why we would want to tackle all of these crises together. Embarking on a mass reforestation and environmental rehabilitation campaign in Australia would not only be popular and not only be necessary, but it would create thousands of jobs. And I think this is one critical thing that we need to understand in the transition, especially as we have 1 million people unemployed in this country at the moment and many, many more without enough hours of work, so i.e. facing the challenge of insecure work. We often think of the transformations that need to occur and the jobs transformations that need to occur as being, in a sense, directly substitutable, i.e. if we get out of coal, then we've got to find jobs for people in renewable energies. There will be jobs for people in renewable energy, but teaching is also a low emissions job. Aged care is also a low emissions job. And so expanding and meeting the other challenges that our society faces is not only a way of tackling those challenges, it's a way of reducing emissions. And so environmental rehabilitation, for example, especially after the devastating bushfires that we've seen, is something that ticks all the boxes of job creation and economic recovery and also tackling the environment and climate emergency. And I guess the last thing that I would say, that's what I would do immediately, and then put in place those 10-year plans and then put in place those other targets. So the last thing I would say is that the targets that we have need to be strong and they need to be binding. And we've got to make sure that we can't backslide on them. So there can be none of this, we will use so-called carryover credits, as if you win the first innings of the test match, if you win the first test match by 300 runs, you don't get to take those 300 runs over to the start of the second test match. So we can't do it by cheating. We're going to need targets that are actually binding, and we need to understand the urgency as well. And I think that, and I'll finish on this as my 7 minutes is up, I'm heartened to see Donald Trump go. That gives me, and I have this sense that with the election of Joe Biden and the appointment of John Kerry in particular as his climate envoy, and his immediate statement that what we signed up to in Paris is not enough, that is crucial, because for the first time a world leader or someone at world leader level is saying what we've done and what we've committed to is not enough to stop climate catastrophe. That is so critical. I want to make sure that the momentum that I feel like we're going into the end of 2020 with and starting 21 doesn't get derailed into, let's have zero emissions in 2050 or 2060 and think about in 2040 how we're going to solve the problem and just hope that we can keep going as we are and then drop down sharply. We've got to bring forward, I think in 2021, we've got to make one of the focuses, what are we going to do over the next decade? Make sure that there's an understanding that this is the critical decade. And I feel that public opinion and global opinion is starting to change in such a way that bold 10-year plans that tackle the kind of crises that I've spoken about all together will not only be popular, they'll be successful. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Adam. Now, Sally is in the fortunate position that she can actually do things at a local level and make it happen on the ground, so to speak. Sally, you now have the floor.
Thank you very much. If I move this forward, yay, I can still speak. To the microphone. How's that for innovation? Working? Excellent. Well, thank you, Roger. It is lovely to be here. I do acknowledge Adam and all our other panellists, and isn't it lovely to be with people in a room having a discussion, but also welcome to everybody who's online, but it really is terrific. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on behalf of the City of Melbourne. That is our commitment as well, to make sure that we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather, the people of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and pay our respects to their elders past and present. The City of Melbourne is on a big reconciliation journey, like many organisations. We're about to amp it up is probably the younger way of saying that, and we believe that every step we can make forward of improving relationships between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people is a benefit, not just for our city, but right across Victoria. I know that I am with the converted today. How lovely. Not all forums are like that. I know that I'm here with many passionate advocates who have much more technical knowledge than I do, but delighted to take the opportunity today to talk a little bit about the things that we have done and that we are planning to do in the City of Melbourne. That's right, Mr. Rees, I've only got 7 minutes. Are you keeping me on time?
Yes.
Do you know that Mr. Rees is the father of our Deputy Lord Mayor, which is very exciting. He comes from good stock, obviously. Here, let me keep going. Now, we know, as the saying goes, there are no jobs if there is no planet, and that's something that we take very seriously at the City of Melbourne. We know that there is a transition, and great to hear those comments from you, Adam, and I agree in terms of the US election. But what really is important is that sense is Australia going to lag behind what the rest of the world is doing? And I think that really takes this concerted, combined effort across all of us to make sure that that doesn't happen. I am so pleased that in our patch, the City of Melbourne, we have been advocating and actioning on these concepts, policies and initiatives for the past 2 decades. And well before I got there, it's really pleasing to come into an organisation that has some really good eco creds, as they're called. I'm going to talk about some of those this morning, or this afternoon now. Gosh, the day passes quickly on a Friday. And delighted that the City of Melbourne is also hooked into so many global alliances, which really helps us with our momentum locally. Part of that is our membership of C40, a fabulous group around the world. And during COVID, we had a C40 Mayors Task Force that worked particularly on making sure that green initiatives, eco initiatives, were at the forefront of our responses in our respective cities to the COVID pandemic. So to go to Adam's comments as well, and some of the initiatives today go directly to that. Last year, we declared a climate and biodiversity emergency in the City of Melbourne. We were the 1,271st city around the world to do that. And whilst that sounds like a lot, we're actually acknowledging that there are so many more cities still to come. We know that there is plenty that we can do to help cut dangerous greenhouse gases, to make sure that we are group purchasing renewables, that we are working hard to make us fossil fuel free as a city. What are we doing around efficient buildings and the planning settings for that in particular? More bike lanes and encouraging public transport, the greening of our streets, rooftops and open spaces, less waste and more recycling. All of those things within 2 major strategies that we also signed off on last year, our climate mitigation strategy and our waste and resource recovery strategy, that work interdependently, which is terrific. We know that cities can do things at scale, and of course the more that cities attract people, the more important it is that cities take responsibility and action. We're also very aware, as I mentioned earlier, that the planning powers that we have and the advocacy that we do to other levels of government and across the private and community sectors must work hand in hand. Earlier this year, in a COVID environment, we endorsed the new Sustainable Building Design protocols as part of a planning scheme amendment, which now sit with state government for sign-off. But those standards will definitely lift the bar on what we expect in terms of new buildings within our municipality. We want to ensure that as individuals and as a population we can survive the worst of climate shocks, and at the same time embrace the economic opportunities that spring from innovation, from technological responses, and really from transformation. We know we're working with a number of industries and our universities on some of these initiatives, and I'm just going to go through a few of them. Many of you will know that we've been certified carbon neutral since 2012. which was a really big step forward for us. We use 100% renewable energy, which we source through the Melbourne Renewable Energy Project, something that was initiated at the City of Melbourne, and we have cut our actual emissions by 76% since 2012, and we've had operational savings of more than $1 million as a result of that project, and really proud to say that MREP 2 is currently underway with another lot of big organisations around town. Of course, the bushfires over summer show us that there is so much more to do. So back in February, to support our climate change and biodiversity emergency declaration, we committed to reaching our own ambition of zero net emissions, which previously had been 2050. We've brought that forward to 2040, and we're working on it now, Adam. We're not waiting till 2030 to do that. We are very aware that for us to achieve that as a municipality, we certainly can't do it on our own. The things that we do can take steps forward. We can show that leadership. We can provide demonstration, information and support, but we absolutely need to work with everybody else who has a footprint in the city, including those that come in and out of the city daily, to be able to achieve this. We do believe that weak targets create a drag on the global impact that we're all trying to achieve. So what can we do at a local level? And we acknowledge that declaring the emergency isn't a tick in the box. That's just the start in terms of how we need to go forward. The real measures of our success, we believe, is when we see our BAU be something completely different in the City of Melbourne, and we do see that COVID creates that disconnect for us to be able to take bounds forward instead of just steps forward. We are assessing all of our goals and operations. We're reassessing them with the lens of these Sustainable Development Goals so that we can be more focused, but also so that we can measure and benchmark ourselves in an international context. We are acting on our 2 decades of climate change to make sure that we are very clear with our community about what a climate emergency means for them. In economic terms, and this is some of the storytelling that we're doing through our strategies, climate change could mean a $12.6 billion loss to the city by 2050. So for those that are motivated by the hip pocket, that is something that is very compelling. And that estimate was made prior to the impacts of COVID, of course, this year. We're expecting 20% less rainfall by 2050. We're expecting, as a result of that, more heat waves and for our air quality to decline rapidly. Sea levels will increase by 24 centimetres on 1990s levels, and we have some fabulous graphics to show what that means for our business owners, our residents and visitors to the city. Something that's very visual for people in the City of Melbourne are our trees. As you know, they're all now QR coded and you can write to them if you would like. But some of our trees, our beautiful trees such as our elms, will struggle to grow in drought conditions. And if we continue on the current trajectory of temperatures, we anticipate that we will lose 35% of our tree stock in the next 2 decades if we don't see dramatic change. And we are so reliant on that tree stock. Species and habitat loss is also a risk. It's why we made sure we added biodiversity into the emergency. And we're very conscious of threatened species such as the powerful owl and the grey-headed flying fox, to name a few. We've just done a bee study, which is actually showing some promising signs. 32 bee species exist in the city, 30 of which are native. And of course, with more of those rooftop beehives, we're seeing an increase in activity, which is great. And I need to stick to my notes because we'll be here all day. The City of Melbourne has identified 10 priorities, which is where we're looking for accelerated actions. And these are, very quickly, a transition of council operations from fossil fuels completely, and that includes our own buildings and our own fleet vehicles. Fast-track delivery of 44 kilometres of protected bike lanes. Oh my goodness, COVID's been wonderful for that. We were planning on that taking 8 years. It'll be done in 18 months. It's just been wonderful. Stimulating our circular economy solutions for waste in particular, a big project where we feel we're behind and we're trying to push that forward. We're embedding climate change and biodiversity action into everything we do as a standard. Every single council paper that comes to us must identify the climate impacts and benefits of that policy or that motion. We're mandating greening and zero emission buildings through our planning scheme. We're accelerating our renewable energy purchasing by businesses and residents. We're looking for a program, we've identified one, that it won't just be for big businesses in terms of renewable energy, but which all of our residents can also get involved in to bring scale that way. Investigating a rates incentive for energy efficient buildings, which we think will be compelling. Building a business coalition to advance the circular economy. Continuing to be bold advocates on behalf of these issues in our community and beyond. And we want to tell Melbourne's climate change and biodiversity story at every chance we get, so that we can play that leadership role. But sharing stories is a really powerful way of creating change. We know that local action must be matched by credible state and federal action. It just can't wait. And so we do spend a lot of our time advocating and working with state government in particular. We leave the federal government to Adam, is that all right? And we hope that those levels of government will join this surge to act as we go forward. We know that the price of inaction is simply too high. It's a burden on our children, on our economy, our environment, our well-being and our reputation. For all of those reasons, it's completely unsustainable for us to keep doing things the way we always have, and we need to be excited about change. We do have some fantastic initiatives underway, even urban farming as a way of creating jobs. Everything that we've talked about in those initiatives have green jobs and new industries involved. We think that's incredibly exciting as we face an uncertain future as a result of COVID. Previous to being here, I was talking to The Age about what a future looks like, and of course they're very focused on the fact that we won't have the same number of workers coming back to the city, which can be devastating, but what it means is it leaves plenty of space for us to create new jobs, and we're hoping that green industries and green jobs will be a big part of that. Thank you so much for having me as part of the panel today, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. The pair of you have ticked quite a few boxes. Let's assume for the panel roundtable that both Adam and Sally now have 3 advisors to review their strategies, plans and manifestos, and perhaps offer some suggestions on how they may even be improved further. Quite clearly we have targets, and I was speaking to Will earlier. I'm a bit bemused because the targets seem to be shortening all the time. I was quoting Johan Rockström's quotes of 50% by 2030, a further 50% by 2040, and 0 by 2050. Well, I heard only recently 6% per annum is what we really need to be going, and Tim Flannery has talked about even 8% per annum, so we have to be carbon neutral by the end of this decade. So that's one of the targets, but as Sally has also picked up on, we need reduction in consumption of natural resources. That's going to be hugely challenging. We need, as a third target, 0 reduction in biodiversity, which Sally has referred to, and 0 environmental degradation and pollution. And these targets need to be measurable. But before we look at those, it's important to look at the kind of society we would need to achieve them, which is what really Robyn was referring to earlier. It's values, aspirations, practices, institutions that will enable us to survive and then work backwards, because business as usual is not going to do it, with the steps that are required to achieve them whilst maintaining these targets as measurable outcomes. And our new society will be very different from the one that exists today, and that will present huge challenges for our democratic system. Now, I'm going to ask Will if you might like to reply on that one and give us an idea of what you think that new society might look like.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. It's going to be hard to say, other than generalities, precisely what it's going to look like. But I think the thing that really gets me excited about the new society is going back to what I was talking about earlier today on tipping points, is that I sense we're approaching a social tipping point, as well as the biophysical ones I was talking about. And the interesting thing in complex systems theory is a couple of things about tipping points. One is they're devilishly hard to predict ahead of time. It's easy after the fact to say, why didn't we see that coming? But looking at it now, I see so many aspects of the way society is changing, even before COVID hit, that I'm sensing that we are approaching a social tipping point, hopefully within the next 5 years or so. But the other thing is it's really hard to define what comes out the other end, other than it's going to be very different. And that's going to be based on the ingenuity, vision, and so on of the societies that emerge after this so-called tipping point. So I think what Sally was saying is exactly a good example of that. We talk about, we're going to lose population from inner cities. Well, that's an opportunity to move in a different direction. So I would hope that the society we emerge from this period of turmoil will obviously be focused on stabilizing the biophysical parts of the Earth system, the climate and so on. But I think it really needs to focus on us becoming far more compatible with the rest of life on the planet. In other words, move from an exploitative society to one that's mutualistic. And I'll just go back to, for those of you who heard my talk, the comment by Mark Williams, a paleobiologist, saying that we are moving into the third stage of biosphere evolution in Earth history, a very bad stage because it's one driven by humans in a bad direction. We need to absolutely turn that around. And I also made the point, too, that you cannot stabilize the climate without stabilizing the biosphere at the same time because they're intricately linked. So I think we should become a society that thinks much more about how we live in harmony with the rest of the planet, with the rest of the living planet, with each other, obviously, but also stabilizing the geophysics, biophysics part of the planet. Again, that's just a broad-brush approach. But I think once you have that vision, you can sort of benchmark what you're aiming to do against those sort of goals.
Thank you. Well, look, I think we can probably even be more specific about some of the changes because